Hello, and welcome to our module lesson for Environment and International Politics. In this module, and in the next module, we're going to be stepping back from kind of a broad view of the international system to looking at how the international system affects particular topics. This week, obviously, we're going to be dealing with the environment and what international politics has to do with environmental change and environmental solutions. So for this module, your learning objectives are as follows. There's only two of them this week, but I think they're pretty important. So first, I want you to be able to distinguish between different strategies for combating climate change. Right? We're going to be talking about how the international community comes together to deal with climate issues. I want you to be able to distinguish between some of the different ideas that are on the table. And the second learning objective I have for you is that you should be able to explain why environmental issues are a part of international politics, right? Why does international politics bother with things like the environment? So let's go ahead and jump in and see what we can see. So some of the topics that are going to fall under the environment, right, that we're going to touch on will be things like climate change and deforestation, nuclear disasters, pollution, natural disasters, extreme weather, wildlife management, and biodiversity. And this one's actually going to come back up a little bit next week as well. And then we're going to be talking about and focusing on the idea of sustainability, right? And what is sustainability, right? We hear that bandied about a lot as a solution to climate change. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about things like geohacking and terraforming, which might be perhaps a different solution to environmental issues. So let's go ahead and just dig right in. Right. Particularly this question of what the international perspective about the environment is, right? So it's kind of the point of view of most international scholars that the environmental crisis really is a national security issue, right? Climate change creates lots of problems that are really as serious of a threat to the integrity of states as much as a military threat. Now, the environment has always played a role in how we as we organize our societies. But let's not forget that society has also had a big impact on the environment for a very long time. Humans have been impacting the environment really as long as we can say that we've been human. Right? This isn't a new thing, right? This isn't something that's just happened in the last 200 years, although there has been a significant change in the intensity of this recently. But this is something that goes back thousands and thousands of years. It really goes all the way back to its roots in the agricultural revolution. Right? Prior to the agricultural revolution, people were primarily nomadic. But some small groups would stick around in more tropical and temperate climates. But really, people would go around and wander, right, from place to place and try to find food to support essentially their tribes. But well, it became very difficult as populations began to expand for this nomadic lifestyle to continue. Right? So what ends up happening, because of the hardship here, humans began to settle down. Right? They began to realize that if they would take care of certain crops, right, they would grow back year after year. They'd keep coming back to the same spot. Particularly, we're talking about grain crops here, right? So as humans began to settle down and start to farm grain crops, we started to see really civilization emerge, right? In the agricultural revolution, we began to change the land around us. We began to domesticate plants and animals. We began to physically change the landscape by building cities, mounds. Over here at LSU, we have a couple of Indian mounds that represent human changing of the land around them. So as we began to become a more urbanized and civilized species, we see that humans begin to have impacts on the environment. Now, these impacts on the environment were fairly low-key until about the time of the Industrial Revolution. And by the time of the Industrial Revolution, we started to see these industrial economies have a larger impact on the environment. Right? There began to be more and more environmental degradation. By the time of the 18th century, we'd already had thinkers come out talking about things like carrying capacity and how humans impact the environment. Right? Thomas Malthus invented this idea of carrying capacity, where he's talking about humans only being able to be supported by a certain amount of land, right? Carrying capacity is this notion that the land can only support a certain size of a population. And Thomas Malthus really began to worry that as the population was growing, we'd no longer be able to feed everyone, right? So the thinking began that we need to limit our population so that we can ensure that everyone who does exist can continue to prosper. This is something called a diminishing returns model, right? This diminishing returns model of growth shows that, right, the more that you add people in, the more they drag on the system. But as the Industrial Revolution began to kick off and really human ingenuity began to take over, right, we see this becomes replaced with what's called the increasing returns model of growth, meaning that the more people you add, the more growth is possible. Now, we're going to come back to that a little bit later, right? But what we're going to really focus in on right now is this link between growth and economic growth and industrialization and pollution. So what we see is that as the Industrial Revolution really took hold in the 19th century, through the 1800s into the 1900s, we see pollution and environmental degradation really go up, right? That's what we're seeing in this chart below us. So as we increase wealth, this also leads to eventually an increase in care about the environment. So things get worse, as you'll see, right? Pre-industrial economies, environmental degradation begins to go up. But then somewhere along the way, once you become industrialized, there's this turning point. And what we're looking at here is actually called the Kuznets curve. This is an observation about growth and environmental care. So once you reach the turning point in the Kuznets curve, you actually see a greater care of the environment, people caring about their environment more and wanting to preserve their environment more. You see the emergence of environmental movements. So as we continue to grow, right, our GDP per capita continues to grow, we actually see the environment begin to get a little bit better. Now, this doesn't just happen naturally on its own. It requires people to actually care and invest time and effort in protecting the environment. So by the turn of the 20th century, right, by kind of the 19-teens, 1920s, we start to see a heavy emergence of an environmental movement. So let's talk about, politically speaking, how the environmental movement came to be. Right. So we see at the beginning of the 20th century a big concern for animals starting to go extinct. Teddy Roosevelt, President Theodore Roosevelt, was really concerned about this. He was a fairly large conservationist. He loved the land around him. So he started to set apart national parks and create things like the Endangered Species Act to set aside nature for nature's sake, as well as trying to protect a large deal of the environment that was around us, right, particularly endangered species. Around the same time, and a little bit later in Europe, right, particularly the Nazi Party, were actually big supporters of environmentalism. They weren't very good with people, but their environmental laws were actually pretty good and are still generally on the books in Germany today. We see environmentalism in its early stages actually have support across the political aisles from both the left and the right. Right, people like Henry David Thoreau wrote Walden is kind of a figure on the political right. John Muir founded the Sierra Club, was a big figure on the political left. And really, we see as we progress through the 20th century into about the 1960s, we see a major rise in the environmental movement, particularly with a few big events that occur. In the 1940s or early 50s, Rachel Carson writes a book called Silent Spring, looking at the impact of pollution on animals. Right? She hypothesized that the use of DDT would right, is what was causing bald eagles to essentially go extinct. Now, her science has since been proven wrong, but this was really a catalytic work. Excuse me. This is really a catalytic work in bringing together the environmental movement. Especially around the same time, we started to see some big events occur. Right, the Torrey Canyon oil spill in the UK was a huge environmental disaster. Got people very focused in on the protecting the environment. A book came out revising and bringing back a lot of the work of Thomas Malthus called The Population Bomb. Got people very worried about the carrying capacity of Earth, leading to some big fears that we simply wouldn't be able to feed our population moving into the 1990s and 2000s. And also at the same time, and this is very influential as well, right? We start to see our first images of Earth from outer space, right? Able to see how fragile our blue planet really is. I've got one of the original pictures right below me here, taken from the moon. And we start to see this idea that we're all kind of on this spaceship that is Earth all together. And this is the only planet we've got, so we need to protect it. So we see the beginnings of the environmental movement really start to coalesce in the 60s and early 70s. And it really starts to take a forefront moving forward. So we see conservation movements also come out from the right, political right as well. Richard Nixon is the one who actually created the EPA, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, all of these things in the 1970s. So the right was also, right, the political right in the United States was also very heavily involved in protecting the environment. The political left, represented by the Club of Rome, putting out their limits to growth, which is in this neo-Malthusian sphere as well. Right, so we see a large deal of support across political spectrums for protecting the environment beginning in the 60s and going into the 1970s. The United Nations actually convened several meetings about this. In 1968, they hold their first Biosphere Conference. In 1972, in Stockholm, they hold a big environmental conference as well. Back at this point in time, the chief concerns were things like pollution, population growth, threat of global cooling. The early climate models weren't very good, and nuclear issues. And then in 1972 as well, we see the 3 Mile Island nuclear event happen in the United States, which freaks a lot of people out, leading to a lot of public maneuvering on the part of the United States to clean up its act, right? They reached the curve, reached the turning point in the Kuznets curve, and we started to see a big push to clean up our environment. There was also a lot of public service announcements and a real famous commercial with the crying Indian. If you haven't ever seen that, please go Google the crying Indian commercial on YouTube and look for this handsome fellow down in the corner. Sorry, that corner. But what we see is that public awareness of pollution really goes up. And we see kind of a broad shift, a shift to environmental impacts, right, and climate change and things like that once pollution is more or less under control by kind of the middle of the 1980s, right? So we, in the West, have become much more focused on environmental issues over the course of the last several decades. Now, into the 80s and 90s, we see some further events that are really important. In 1979, we see the Gaia hypothesis put forward. Now, this is more of a metaphor than people actually thinking the Earth is a single organism that we're all a part of. But it's a nice metaphor for how the environment interacts with each other, with itself. In 1986, we see the Chernobyl nuclear event, which causes some major refocusing of environmental policy. In 1992, the UN holds a Rio conference where we see a shift towards fear of global warming, right, and how we can affect climate change there. In 1997, we see the Kyoto Protocol come into effect, where it's an attempt at a top-down environmental climate action from the UN. 2002 in Johannesburg, right, there's a big conference there. So we see the creation of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UNIPCC, right? That's Al Gore and those guys that won the Nobel Prize really start to study global temperature changes, right? Climate change. And what we see is, right, the very famous graph below us, right below me, where temperatures really begin to change after the 1800s, and they begin to skyrocket. And it's less of a fluctuation than normal. It's more of a, well, it's that hockey stick, if you will. And around the same time, we see a shift in political violence as well. We see the emergence of eco-terrorists, right? Terrorists that are trying to defend the environment. So where does this tie back in with international politics, right? Well, this really comes down to this question of sustainability, right? Now, when we talk about sustainability, right, what are we dealing with? Well, broadly speaking, it's the capacity to endure. Right? It's the ability to keep going, right? We want to be able to create a civilization that is able to endure. And what this translates to in the international sphere is the creation of something called the triple bottom line. And this triple bottom line is human development, right? We need to keep people moving in a better direction. We need quality of life to increase. We need economic development, all right? We need the people to actually have money to fund themselves. And we also need to be protective of the environment, right? These three things are the very base of how all activity should occur, right? This is the fundamental ground upon which sustainability is built. Right, so this means we need to think about human impact on the biosphere and the climate, right? How do we impact other species? Generally speaking, some conservation efforts have been really successful. Wolves, bald eagles, grizzlies, all of these have recently come off of the Endangered Species Act list because they're coming back. Conservation efforts are working along most lines, especially for these kind of marquee animals. But this also has an impact on the climate around us, right? Where this starts to be an international politics issue, aside from pushing this triple bottom line and pushing sustainability issues, right? Sustainability as an issue internationally. We also see it impacting people, right? As the climate changes, this causes displaced persons, right? Especially island nations and coastal areas. There are islands in the Pacific that are simply just not going to exist in the future if there's more than a meter of ocean rise, and that's pretty much locked in at this point. Also, right, I'm in Louisiana. There's a lot of coastal areas that are just plain gone, and people are going to have to move away from them. So this causes migration issues, and of course, climate change is not a internationally recognized foundation for refugee status. So this causes a lot of problems as well. And of course, as these people have to move away from where they used to live, this causes a loss of culture and diversity within the human tapestry as a whole. So a lot of these issues come into play. These are big international problems that we need to think about. But when it comes to the idea of sustainability, how do you actually promote, right? What are the real things that the UN seeks to promote? Recently, there's been a lot of talk about the Paris Convention that the United States has recently decided to pull out of, right? A lot of these, even though Paris was voluntary, these are the kinds of things that were to be promoted under the Paris Agreement, these sustainability issues. So first, there's this idea that we need to regulate our economies and the way that they interact with the environment. Particularly, we need to better regulate industry and decrease overall carbon outputs. They need to have anti-pollution measures to clean air and clean water. There needs to, broadly speaking, be a shift towards renewable resources, which is pretty much underway at this point, regardless of what the U.S. government might want to do. Of course, there's the individual effort to reduce human consumption, right? You might notice that even Walmart these days gives you a discount for bringing your own bags. So there's this idea that humans should use less, right? Try to make do with the minimum that we can. As well as smart energy creation and distribution and more power storage all along the way. But there's kind of a large systemic push towards sustainability that requires a lot of different action across a lot of different fronts. And this is something that's being promoted very heavily internationally. States have voluntarily signed on to the Paris Accords, saying what they will be capable of doing on their own, and kind of this idea that we're all going to shame each other into doing better. Pretty much the entire world signed on to this except for 3 countries at this point: the US, Syria, and Nicaragua. Nicaragua didn't sign on to it because it wasn't good enough. They wanted more. So we'll see how this plays out over the next few years, but this is definitely something that's at the forefront of international politics these days. But something that comes along with this, and a big question that's been asked over the last several decades, is if we are basically putting a leash on how you can develop, right, this sustainable development, is it really fair to those who haven't actually developed yet? Right, so we in the West were able to wreck our environment while developing, but we're saying that you can't develop unless you do it in a clean way. Now, maybe this is a learning from our mistakes kind of thing, but there's a lot of question about whether or not this is really a fair situation for everyone involved. Of course, the end goal here is to create some sort of like steady state economy where everything is really sustainable, right? Where growth is pretty much locked in, where Humans are all in a better situation, right? We've kind of eradicated poverty and disease as much as possible. Everyone's pretty well economically developed, and the environment is protected, right? Coming back to this triple bottom line. But there's fears about what the carrying capacity of Earth can be, and why right? There's a lot of fears over actually being able to feed everyone moving forward. Now, this isn't the first time that these have this fear has come about, right? As we mentioned, these neo-Malthusians have been thinking about this since at least the 1950s and 60s. And there was a lot of fear that the 90s and 2000s would see food riots and massive famines and terrible things that, frankly, just never happened. Now, why didn't they happen? Largely speaking, this is due to the Green Revolution, right? Where humans have come in and begun to innovate and come up with new ways of doing things. Really, technology has been able to increase our carrying capacity widely on the face of this earth. The father of this Green Revolution is a man named Norman Borlaug. He was an agricultural chemist who is pretty much responsible for saving at least 1 billion lives. He developed new, more efficient strains of wheat and ways to grow this wheat called the dwarf wheat, which has really been responsible for expanding the carrying capacity of Earth massively. So human ingenuity and innovation really heavily tie into this question. But one of the things that's come up recently is that maybe sustainability isn't enough. Maybe we've already crossed this Rubicon and we're going to have to fix the environment, much less prevent it just from getting worse. So this is where human ingenuity is going to come back in. And this is a new set of solutions that matter here, right? Here, I got to move myself real quick. So what we're talking about here is something called geoengineering or geohacking or terraforming. What this is the deliberate large-scale change of the climate to counter the consequences that we've already brought about. So the idea is that we're not just waiting to, hoping that we've done enough to prevent the environment from changing too much. This is a deliberate attempt to undo the damage, to fix the problem, not just hope that it's not going to get worse. So what this means is large-scale engineering changes to the planet to try to fix the problems that we've already created. Now, this isn't almost no one advocates geoengineering solutions on their own. Pushes towards sustainability are still a very viable and important part of this. But maybe it just hasn't been enough, and we're going to have to fix the problem as well. So what are some of the things that go into geoengineering? Well, the biggest one people talk about is carbon sequestration. It's a bit of a tongue tire, but what it means is basically taking the excess carbon that we've put into the atmosphere and shoving it back in the earth. What we see on the images above me, particularly the one right here, is this idea of carbon capture, right? So we take the carbon via various methods and actually reliquefy it and pump it back into the earth from which we pulled it out. And that's a pretty important idea, right? We could actually undo the damage that we've done, right? Not just get around heat increases, but actually physically clean up the environment. Some other ideas are the idea of increasing the Earth's albedo. If you'll remember from your hard sciences classes, albedo is the reflectivity of light. So the Earth has a certain albedo. What we could do is attempt to increase how much light goes back out into space, right? Make the Earth more reflective. We could do this by painting roads and roofs white. We could do this by injecting particularly sulfur into the atmosphere, although that one's a little bit more on the dangerous side. We could, there's a variety of things we could do to reduce the amount of sun that gets to the Earth. We could build space-based sunshades. You'll see that image directly above me, above the carbon sequestration image. And basically we could build a giant umbrella in space to keep the sun from getting here. And we could also use it as a solar energy collector and beam that energy back down to Earth. So we could still get the energy without taking on the heat. That's a pretty interesting idea. I'm kind of a fan of it, but I'm also a big space advocate. So space, clean up the environment, that all goes together for me. Another thing that's actually been tried to some small degree is the idea of making sea algae bloom, right? And as the algae blooms, it gobbles up CO2, it gets fat, it dies, it falls to the bottom of the ocean, and it stays there. That's another way to get CO2 out of the atmosphere. Of course, we could create some sort of artificial tree that would maybe pull CO2 out as well. So these geoengineering solutions, these are just kind of the tip of the iceberg on the solutions that we could come up with. This represents basically the fix the solution, not just hope it doesn't get as bad way of doing things. So if we've already managed to screw up our environment beyond large changes, which is a distinct possibility at this point, we would probably need to undertake some sort of these big human ingenuity solutions, these geoengineering solutions to try to fix the problems. So those are kind of our two big approaches here, right? Geoengineering versus sustainability, and perhaps they feed into each other in some way. But whatever it is, this is going to require a large deal of international effort and coordination to solve this, right? The environment is something that really affects everyone on the planet, and it's hard for anyone to go it alone on these things. So this is an inherently international problem, and negotiating how we're going to deal with this is going to be a global issue. But for now, let's think about our next steps. All right. So your next steps, obviously, are complete your readings from both books. Module 13 quiz, Module 13 assignment. Ask me any questions or concerns, post them to the forum. If necessary, I'll try to get to them as soon as possible. And then move on to your final lecture module. Right, next module is going to be Technology and International Politics. And this one's kind of my favorite, right? Talking about less, right, taking this kind of backwards looking, right, how has history led us here, and more looking at trends in technology that might impact international politics and the world around us moving forward. So thank you for paying attention. Good luck on your lessons, and I will see you in the next module.